Доброго дня. Ми, напевно, будемо розпочинати. Тоні Палмер, візит другий в Український католицький університет. І я маю за честь представити людину, яку і в Україні, і в світі вважають легендою сучасного кіно. Тоні Палмер проведе зустріч, тема зустрічі зазначена була в анонсі, модеруватиме Богдан Ворон. Працюємо в режимі 2 годин. Розмова Богдана з Тоні, а потім ваші питання. Я розумію, що Тоні не зовсім з нами, можемо 4 години працювати. Приблизно так. То я думаю, що ми розпочнемо, ви нагаєте час. Богдане, прошу.
Дякую.
When is tea time?
4 p.m.
4 p.m. Tea time is 4 p.m.
Отже, наша програма буде наступна. Ми спочатку працюємо годину питання-відповідь між нами. Модератор я Богдан Ворон, студент майстерської програми журналістики, і відповідає Тоні Палмер. Потім ми слухаємо запитання від вас. Працюємо в режимі питання-відповідь з аудиторії. Отже, тема нашої зустрічі – це від Observer до BBC. Тоні Палмер, окрім того, що він знаменитий, славнозвісний режисер, який зняв дуже багато фільмів про музику, про музикантів і не тільки, про художників, про співаків і танцюристів, він також журналіст, який працював дуже багато для знаменитих англійських часописів. Отже, я хотів би почати нашу розмову із такого цікавого факту Тоні Палмера. Він після закінчення Кембриджського університету подав свою анкету на те, щоб влаштуватися до BBC. Він був один з 4 тисяч аплікантів, і його анкета іще 7 була відібрані BBC. Я хотів би запитатися Тоні, як вдалося пробитися в цю компанію, яку ви пізніше описали з відомим літературним твором «О, цей дивний світ», так? Пам'ятаєте, Brave New World, офіс BBC, там нагадував таку от цікаву річ. Розкажіть, як вам вдалося потрапити на BBC?
This is working. This is working. Well, I mean, the obvious answer is because I'm obviously brilliant. The truth, however, is a bit different. And since I suspect that the same problem will be confronting you before very long, how do I get a job? I knew when...
You don't need to listen to the translation.
You mean I don't have to listen to myself?
Yes.
In Ukraine.
The same problem will confront you, I suspect, when you are trying to get a job. Now, I knew when I applied to the BBC that the particular job I wanted, there were going to be a huge number of people applying. So I went to talk to a friend to say, have you got any clues to help me? And he said, yes. 2 things. He said, wear a tie. I mean, I normally never wear shirts and ties, as you possibly can see. But he said, on this occasion, you will wear a shirt and you will wear the most hideous tie you can imagine. You know, bright yellow, bright green, one that's got little lights on that kind of flick on and off, anything, just a hideous tie. And at some point in the interview, they will ask you, what is your expertise? What do you know? So you will say something completely different. So I went to the interview and I wore a hideous yellow tie. I've still got the tie. I mean, it's unspeakably awful. And they said, and what is your special interest? Now don't forget, I was trained at university as a mathematician. Well, I was originally a mathematician. So what I should have said was, I'm a very good mathematician, or I have a creative vision of the future, or some rubbish like that. So what I said was, I'm an expert on horse race betting. And I remember looking at the faces of the 3 people who were interviewing me. What? I said, I'm an expert in horse race betting. You tell me any horse, I will tell you what the odds are on the horse, and I will tell you how much it has won and how much it will win. Because I knew that they had no idea what I was talking about. Absolutely no idea. I then got the job, and as Bodan said, and many years later I read my report from this interview. And the report's very interesting. It said, this man is an expert on horse race betting. We need people like that in the sports department of the BBC. He has a very bad dress sense because of this yellow tie. Now the moral of this story is you've got to go and do something at the interview, which they won't forget, because if you just arrive and smile politely and say, I know I have a vision for the future, I know exactly, and they won't remember you at all. But they will remember you if you go along and say something so completely stupid that they'll think, oh, he knows all about horse race betting. So the answer to your question is, that's how I got the job in the BBC, by being an expert on horse race betting, about which I know absolutely nothing. And I have never worked in the sports department. I never want to work in it. I like football, but I never want to work for it. So that's the key to my future. I am an expert on horse race betting. It's true. Oh, sorry.
Тоні, ви працювали на BBC під керівництвом людини, яку називають піонером телебачення Британії, це Кен Рассел. А також співпрацювали з містером Келшоу. І ваша дорога до телебачення і зйомок фільмів почалася в якості хлопчика на побігеньках, T-boy, так? І ви почали з радіо. Розкажіть, будь ласка, ви також є автором радіомагазину, радіопрограми про мистецтво Nightways. Розкажіть, будь ласка, про цю програму, який її формат, і розкажіть ще, як працювало BBC в той час, і що ви почерпнули від Кена Рассела, відомого режисера і актора, до речі.
Well, there's 6 questions there. Let's start with Ken Russell. At the time I joined the BBC, Ken Russell was a real pioneer in that he was making films about musicians, about composers in a completely radical different way. I mean, it's almost impossible to think back that number of years and remember that the very first film he made about a composer was about Prokofiev. And there was an endless argument about whether we should actually see a character in the film, it was a documentary, a character in the film called Prokofiev. And the compromise was, eventually, in this famous film that was made, well, we could see the hands, and we can say the hands are those of Prokofiev. I mean, it's incredible, but that's the maximum that the BBC thought was possible to show of a living character. Now, think how far we've come since then. If I can call it the breakthrough film that he made was a film about the English composer Elgar, where now we had a real character called Elgar, an actor obviously, but he was not allowed to speak. But the film was so full of beautiful images, and the really important thing was that Ken Russell found a way to show how important Elgar was as a composer. Later he made a film about Bartók in the same way, to show how important they were as composers and how important the music was. And it was a way of I was going to say propaganda, but in a sense that's the case, because the BBC was founded in 1926 by a man called John Reith, Lord Reith as he became. And he said, public service broadcasting. And this is the example for all public service broadcasting around the world ever since. It's incredible, but it is the moral. He said that public service broadcasting had 3 qualities which were absolutely essential. The first was information, the second was entertainment, and the third was education. Now, those were, for any public service broadcaster, incredibly important. And the moral of, I mean, on the famous BBC logo, there's a symbol and a little sign underneath which says, nation shall speak truth unto nation. Now just think what that means. Nation shall speak truth unto nation. Information, it's got to be true. It's got to be entertaining, otherwise why are we doing it? In other words, it's got to be interesting, otherwise why are we doing it? And it's got to be education. Education in the general sense. Not sort of teaching you, but education to lead out, to give you things which otherwise you can't find. Now, if we take contemporary television now as an example, think of, I'm sure the name means something to you, I'm not sure whether the films have come here, a great British television maker of films called David Attenborough. David Attenborough makes natural life films. I mean, just think, you know, we can see what the Antarctic looks like. We can see what seals underneath the water look like. We can see how birds fly. This is incredible, incredible. This is given to our generation, in a way that no previous generation ever had that possibility, ever, ever. They could see drawings, they could have it explained, you know, the bird's wings do this, or whatever they do, but not pictures in front of us. Pictures that are on television, pictures that are accessible to absolutely everybody. That's education in the proper sense. Now, translating that now to music and the things which interested me and interested Ken Russell, that's what Ken Russell was doing. They were saying, here's a great composer, Bartók. What do you know about Bartók? Most people who would watch television know nothing about Bartók, but I'm going to try and tell you in an interesting way what an extraordinary man he was, what an extraordinary composer he was, how fascinating Hungary was at that time, and so on and so on. Education, lead out. But information, here's the facts. No, not propaganda, not what, well, it wouldn't have affected Bartók, but I mean, there was German Nazi propaganda about Bartók, which was totally misleading. Totally misleading. The Nazi propaganda, I've actually got the newspaper, says that Bartók emigrated to the United States, where he lived until he died, and he died of starvation because those terrible Americans, you know, they weren't feeding him. It was a lie, a complete lie. So information in the sense of, you know, trying to tell the truth, and entertainment in the sense of making it interesting. So if you think of those natural life programs that are on television, a huge amount now, that's the perfect example of what public service broadcaster is. Now the BBC is complicated. People always think about the BBC that it's a state organisation. It is not a state organisation. It gets into trouble at least twice a week for criticising the state. That's part of its job, to criticise the state, the government. But it has a licence fee. Everybody has to buy the licence fee. It's nothing. It's less than a packet of cigarettes. It's less than a pint of beer a week. Nothing. Peanuts. Peanuts when you think what you get. For the BBC you get 16 channels. You get about 18 orchestras, 5 big symphony orchestras, huge amounts of things, for less than a pint of beer. That's it. So there's no advertising. Advertising is forbidden. So in that sense, it's public service. But because you have to buy a license, people say, oh, it's a state organisation. I'm telling you, it is not a state organisation. So the BBC is an extraordinary institution, one of the great national treasures of Britain. It has problems. All organisations have problems, but I believe it to be one of the great organisations of our time. Now, within that context, within that organisation, come all kinds of extraordinary people. Back to Ken Russell. Ken Russell saw it as his mission, if you like, to try and interest people in music in one way or another. Now, interestingly enough, the BBC already had one radio channel, the third programme, Radio 3, entirely devoted to classical music. But that's a minority will listen to Radio 3. What Ken Russell wanted to do, and what I have always wanted to do, is to get through to the biggest possible audience. You know, there's no point in talking to a tiny minority, because the tiny minority, they know about Bartók. Keep taking Bartók as an example. Even if they know nothing about Bartók, they will tell you they know all about Bartók. What I wanted to do, what Ken wanted to do, was to try and find a way to make images, to make pictures, to make films, which would get through to the widest possible audience and introduce people to things that they thought they knew about, but they didn't. Now, in my case, for example, to take one example, not a very important example perhaps, but I was taken in 1973, I was taken to meet in Paris Maria Callas, a great singer, as you know. Now,
найкраще сопрано 20-го століття.
Maria Callas. And she at that time was in very poor health and in fact died a few years later. I always thought Maria Callas was very extraordinary. As Bogdan has just said, she was thought to be one of the great singers of the 20th century, but there was something wrong with her voice. It wasn't a pure voice. You could find many, many other sopranos who had more beautiful voices. But why was Maria Callas so fascinating? I mean, she hadn't sung on stage since 1965, this is 1973, but everybody knew, they thought they knew, about Maria Callas. I got very curious, what is it about Maria Callas' voice, the sound of her voice, that is so mesmerizing? So we started to make a film about her. During the course of making the film, we discovered that, I mean, it was an extraordinary discovery. We discovered that she'd had the most horrible love affair with a man called, a Greek called Aristotle Onassis, which had absolutely destroyed her career. Destroyed her career, destroyed her mind, destroyed her voice. And in the course of that, she then gave, in the last few years of her life, half a dozen of the greatest performances on stage that it's possible to imagine as a result of this terrible catastrophe in her love life. Because singers need to feel good in order to sing beautifully. If it's not working up here, it's not going to work in here. It'll work, but not in a very interesting way. So we made a film about this. And when that film came out, everybody was amazed. Not because it was a particularly good film or a bad film, but suddenly people realized that was what was extraordinary about this woman. This was a woman who stood on stage, broken in spirit, broken in mind, broken in voice, but who could still mesmerize us. And that's, I think, what people responded to. So that's what I do. I mean, I'm trying to find out what's going on up here in the people that I'm making films about, if they're musicians.
Sorry for interrupting you. Перепрошую, що вас перебиваю. І ви згадали про те, що ви намагаєтеся дістатися до того, що в людини в думці. І я згадую одразу поста Пітера Селлерса, про фільм, про якого ви зробили. Пітер Селлерс – знаменитий актор. Він знявся в якості Рожевої пантери, інспектора Клузо, також у фільмах Стенлі Кубрика. І Тоні зробив про нього фільм для BBC. І саме цей фільм став останньою краплею, можна так сказати. Це було завершенням кар'єри Тоні на BBC і початком його власної кар'єри. Справа в тому, що цей фільм хотіли скорочувати нещадно, а Тоні наполіг, щоб цей фільм в жодному випадку не коротили, тому що коли Пітер Селлерс побачив цей фільм, він розплакався, бо він побачив, що цей фільм показує його справжнє обличчя. Людина, яка могла зіграти будь-кого, будь-що, будь-коли, але втрачала себе, не могла знайти себе в цьому світі. І я, напевно, не помилюся, коли скажу, що Тоні написав в одному з своїх статей інформацію, що BBC – це купка освічених гномів, які намагаються нас навчити, що можна дивитися, а що ні. Тоні, розкажіть, будь ласка, як це відбулося, як цей розрив з BBC відбувся, і чому ви вважаєте, що BBC – це найбільш зарозуміла і самоправна організація світу?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I was absolutely at the point of wanting to leave the BBC and become independent. I mean, it was in my mind. You know, like a lot of young people, I was very silly. very arrogant, and I thought, I know how to do things and I don't want somebody else to tell me. I mean, it's the problem with being young. Well, it's the glory of being young. And I got to know Peter Sellers, the actor, very well, and I wanted to make a film about him. And I realized straight away that Peter Sellers, like all great comics, was not funny in himself. I mean, it's extraordinary to think back before I made that film, which was in 1970, 71, that we assumed that very great comic people, whether it's Chaplin or Buster Keaton or Peter Sellers, since you mentioned, that these were very funny people. Peter Sellers told me a very sad story at one point. He said, I said to him, I've been with you now at quite a number of public parties. You obviously enjoy going to parties. And he said, well, I do and I don't. He said, because what tends to happen if I go out to a party is that somebody will come up to me and say, oh, you're that Peter Sellers chap. And Peter would say, yes, it's me. And so this person would say, do us one of those funny things. How do somebody do a funny thing? It's a completely stupid question. So in making the film, of course, I realized that the great point about all comics is that they're not particularly funny people in themselves. They're wonderful on stage or they're wonderful on the screen. I mean, Peter Sellers on the screen is absolutely hysterically funny. But to talk to him, he was very serious, rather sad, Jewish, adored his mother, this is a Jewish complex, but he was not naturally funny. And like a lot of great actors, did I say something funny? Oh good, I'm glad you're listening. Like a lot of great actors, they don't know who they are. Because they go on stage as Richard III, Laurence Olivier, perfect. Give them a character, they're away. Take the character away, and they're not quite sure who they are as personalities. Now, Laurence Olivier was a very interesting case in point, because there's no greater presence in English theatre the last 100 years than Laurence Olivier. Whether it's Henry V or Richard III or whichever, or Hamlet, his dominating personality and the character he gave these people is so extraordinary that you think that's the man. But you could meet you could meet Laurence Olivier in the pub, in the bar down there, you wouldn't notice him. He was completely insignificant, out of costume, out of character. Now, if you're a famous comic and you're expected to do funny things all the time, and suddenly you're not funny, and you're very sad, rather serious and quiet, and what's more, you're a great actor who has no personality of his own, or doesn't know what that personality is, then it's very, very hard. And that's what we tried to make a film about with Peter Sellers, to take away all these funny characters that he did, to take away, this is the person who will do funny things, except in the film he does a lot of very funny things, but that's actually not him. The real him was much more extraordinary and much more interesting. That's what makes film about. And the BBC were shocked, because they just thought, oh, Peter Sellers, he's that very great comedian. Why can't we have a film about a great comedian? Well, actually, I think the film I've made is a bit different. Only 2 sentences. Peter Sellers.
І повертаючись до журналістики, паралельно до BBC ви працювали в якості музичного критика. У вас була своя колонка на Spectators і Observer – це дві найбільші англійські газети того часу. Ось ви працювали для Observer, і в редакції цих газет надходили листи, де читачі казали, якщо Тоні Палмер буде продовжувати писати те, що він пише, ми перестанемо передплачувати цю газету. Як це сталося? Це раз. Чому така контроверсійна реакція на ваші речі, на ваші статті? І розкажіть ще, як це писати про музику, про культуру? Бо музику треба слухати, а як можна про це написати? Бо ви відкрили, до речі, це цікавий факт, ви відкрили таких музикантів, як Джиммі Гендрікс, Лед Зеппелін, пишучи про них вперше для газет. Розкажіть, будь ласка, про це.
I've got the point. I've got the point. Well, again, it's now almost impossible to think back what is now 45 years. I mean, that's older than anybody here, I think. Because then, in the mid-60s, in England, and we're talking about quality newspapers now, I mean, like the Times and the newspaper called The Guardian and The Observer, which you mentioned, which is one of the main quality Sunday newspapers, that they would never write about popular music. Never. I mean, popular music, what was that? Long hairs, drugs, sex, all those horrible things which we don't mention in a quality newspaper. That was the point, a quality newspaper. But it was perfectly obvious to me and to a lot of other people, I mean, I wasn't alone, in realizing that the music that was being made by the Beatles, by Pink Floyd, by Led Zeppelin a little while later, by The Who, by Cream, this was extraordinary musical revolution. I mean, something really special was happening. We now know, of course, I mean, I was at the concert last night, we now know that 50 years later that's the music people remember. But at the time it was clear that something special was happening. So the Observer newspaper, which had a wonderful collection of critics, of art critic, of film critic, theatre critic, I mean the most famous critics, English critics of the day worked at the Observer. They suddenly telephoned me and they said, would I consider writing a column about popular music? And I thought, why not? Why not? Now, two problems. The first, Bogdan has mentioned, that I think I published about 3 articles. It was every Sunday. I published about 3 articles, and suddenly the editor summoned me. Now, the editor of, like all quality newspapers, especially in those days, was very aristocratic, patrician, very proper gentleman. And I was summoned to his office, and I remember I had to stand, which was slightly embarrassing. Not do sit down, let's have a talk. I made to stand in front of his desk, like the schoolmaster, headmaster, and me. And he said, indicating this great pile, he said, we have this huge pile of complaints about your column. And I said, oh dear, thinking that I was going to be given the sack. And I said, I almost said, well, I really am very, very sorry, but I mean, I was sort of thinking what, as it were. And he said, and went up like this, he said, can you keep doing it? And I said, sure, why? And he said, because we don't want those people. We want young people to read our newspaper. So that was the first, not a problem, but, you know, old people reacted very badly to the fact that you're reading a serious article about Harold Pinter or Samuel Beckett, and next to it is these dreadful people called the Pink Floyd, you know, side by side. How can you do this? It's an outrage. So that was the first problem. But the second problem was, classical music, yes, there was a language which people understood, where you could describe what it was you were listening to, you know, because there was a tradition of writing about classical music, so which people understood. But how do you start writing about pop music, which there was no language? There was, you know, you couldn't say, well, you know, he had 6 girlfriends, his hair was down to here, and man, does it go? Or some rubbish like that. You know, you simply couldn't. So you had to try and devise a language that someone who's reading a serious article about Samuel Beckett or Harold Pinter or William Faulkner or Mozart, next door is reading about the Pink Floyd in language that is similar. Now, of course, some of the pop writers in the pop music newspapers said, oh, Palmer's an idiot. He's writing about the style. It's pretentious, as he would say. It's exaggerating it. And in one, as it became, quite famous piece that I wrote at that time, reviewing the Beatles' White Album, you know, the big double White Album, I compared the Beatles as songwriters with Schubert. And that caused the biggest pile of outrage letters. How dare this man speak of the Beatles and Schubert in the same sentence? He is clearly mad. Now, of course, now, here we are 45, 46 years later, and we can understand that comparison. It's a good comparison. You know, they both wrote for money. They both wrote to be performed today, not tomorrow. They both wrote to be performed in cafes. I think it's a good comparison. I'm rather proud of that comparison. But at the time, this was a terrible idea. Now we accept it. So that was the second big problem. How to find a language to describe youth culture in a way that didn't frighten people who are reading about Faulkner or Mozart or whatever, but thought, there may be something interesting here. Perhaps we'd better take notice of this, which in fact is what happened. And I'm not saying because I wrote it, but in the Observer, that was the first time that anybody had seriously written. I mean, it's before Rolling Stone magazine. Rolling Stone magazine got going about a year later. I'm not saying because of me, it certainly didn't start because of me, but there was the same beginnings of starting to take this culture seriously as a really important contribution to the culture of our time, which of course is what the Beatles themselves believed, but most people didn't at that time.
Дякую, Тоні. І ваш стиль також люблять називати контроверсійним, суперечливим. Я хотів запитатися, чи цей стиль, який ви витворили в кіно, він походить із BBC, із телебачення, із репортерства і журналістики. Ми можемо бачити в вашому кіно, наприклад, грає Джиммі Хендрікс, а потім йдуть коментарі, або Джон Леннон і його ліверпульська четвірка Бітлз грають, пізніше не дають інтерв'ю, жодного закадрового голосу. Розкажіть, будь ласка, про ваш стиль і методи роботи із телефільмами. Чи ви намагаєтеся дістати якийсь кадр, намагаєтеся зробити композицію в кадрі, чи ви це переводите на плечі самого оператора, наймаєте фахівців, а самі займаєтеся тільки логістикою? Бо ви раніше сказали, що зробити фільм – це не є велика загадка чи проблема. Вам потрібно просто зробити список тих, кого ви хочете опитати, і потім це все змонтувати. І ще цікава є особливість в ваших фільмах. Ви дуже любите поєднувати класику і рок-музику. І звідки це бажання? Розкажіть про свій стиль.
Well, that's a separate question. Style, it's a very difficult thing to answer that. I mean, not the first film I made, but the second film I made, which is called All My Loving, which was made at the suggestion of John Lennon, as you know, but that's a separate story. But the interesting thing, if you're just talking about style, it's like it's like one of my children, who are very small, in a toy shop or a paint box. They've suddenly got a lot of paints. So it's splash a bit there, and splash a bit there, and splash a bit here. In other words, I'm playing with this wonderful toy shop called filmmaking, and my God, I'm going to try everything. Fast cutting, strange effects, you know. Every trick I can think of is in All My Loving. Now, I know the film is, if you're not coming to, what's it called, Truskavets tonight, is an enormously powerful film, I know. But it's a mess. It's an absolute mess. Because it's so full of tricks. So full of tricks. And the only thing I've learned after 100 or so films is that the only thing that matters when you're making a film is what is being said. The content is absolutely everything. The style is irrelevant. You should never think about style. You should only ever think about what is it that you're trying to say. And if you can't say it clearly and simply so that everybody can understand, why am I doing this? So my style, insofar as I understand it, has got simpler and simpler and simpler and simpler. And if I could film absolutely everything in my back garden, I would. Because apart from anything else, I don't have to go anywhere. I can just sit in the back garden and make the film. Not as simple as that. But the style is irrelevant. The content gets simpler and simpler and simpler. That's as far as the style is concerned. But how do I approach a subject? That's a different question. And if it, for example, if it's going to be a composer that I don't know particularly well, but there's something about this person that I'm interested in. I make films about people. I mean, the Maria Callas film, which we mentioned, is a film, I would like to say, it's a film about a woman who is in a hell of a mess, brackets, who's also a great singer, close brackets, rather than a film about a singer. Oh, by the way, she's a woman in a hell of a mess. People who interest me, always the people, the people, the people. But I'm making a film now about a composer. The composer as a man interests me. So how do I start? I start by listening and listening and listening forever and ever. I mean, I really do mean for years, to this particular composer's music. Trying to understand what is it that he's trying to tell me. Because I believe, and I have known a number of great composers who've said exactly this, that all composers, without exception, every note they put on the page, they are trying to tell us something about themselves, about the world they live in, about what they feel about this or that. There's a message, in other words. It's not just notes on a page. There's a message. I'll give you a wonderful example of that in a minute. So, if you come from that point of view, I know people are absolutely against that point of view, but if you come from that point of view, then I'm now going to listen and listen and listen hundreds, if not thousands of times to the same piece of music, trying to hear what it is this man or woman sometimes is trying to tell me. I never can be certain of the answer, but I get to a moment where I think I have a clue. So that clue will then prepare me for what I must then do. And you're right to some extent. It then becomes a question of logistics. Well, I must talk to this person, this person, this person. I must go film this person, this person, this person. But it's against that background of thinking that I now know what he's trying to tell me, or he or she is trying to tell me. Because most of filmmaking is logistics, unfortunately. I mean, I spend a huge amount of my time trying to find the money to make the films. I find the whole process of making the films an agony in the sense that it's boring. It's really boring. I've got to go and interview Mr. X, and Mr. X is very interesting, and I'm looking forward to meeting him. That means I've got to hire a crew, I've got to pay them money, I've got to get from there to there. It's logistics, logistics, logistics. The really wonderful moment is when it comes to the editing, which is the final point that you made. Now, what is really interesting is I actually went to a demonstration of this a few years ago. You take 3 pieces of celluloid, or videotape, or whatever it is, A, B, C. If you put them together as A, B, C, they have one effect. If you change them, A, C, B, same pieces of film, just move the order around, totally different effect. Totally different. There is absolutely no logical explanation for that, but it is fact. So the editing is the really fascinating thing. I can speed up, I know how to speed up your emotions when I'm watching it. I know how I can get you right to the point of tears. I know how I can send you to sleep, that's even easier, just by arranging the material. The material is exactly the same, but that's what you have to learn. You have to learn how to do those things. So it's more, somebody else defined it as 98% perspiration, sweat, and just 2% inspiration. I would say it's 100% perspiration and no percent inspiration. No percent. Just you have to do it. I have a perfect example of this, what I quoted you before, of saying that every composer meant something by the notes. Stravinsky famously said that music can express nothing, only itself, which is just notes on a page. It's a famous statement of Stravinsky. And when we were making this big film about Stravinsky, we went to interview the widow of a man called Samuel Dushkin. Samuel Dushkin was a great violinist for whom Stravinsky had written the violin concerto, his violin concerto. Now, you just need to know a tiny bit about Stravinsky's history. Stravinsky, when he lived in Russia, married his cousin. And they built a house in Oosterloo, as you know, probably. And they had 4 children. Stravinsky then came to the West, came to Paris, then to France, and when he moved to Paris, he completely fell in love with another woman. And Stravinsky was a very religious man, so he couldn't divorce wife number 1. So for 15 years, he had 2 households. One with his mistress, one with his wife and 4 children. Now don't forget, the wife was his cousin. Now in Russian Orthodox Church, that's illegal. And in the Russian state, that was illegal. So he married his cousin illegally, apart from anything else. So it was a big problem for him. What do I do? So he had these 2 households. Now, come back to the violin concerto. We interviewed Mrs. Dushkin, and Mrs. Dushkin told us that she would often go to performances of the violin concerto, played by her husband, and when it came to the 3rd movement, which is called Aria number 2, Stravinsky, who was sitting next to her, just burst out crying. Always, every performance. Eventually, Mrs. Dushkin had the courage to ask Mr. Stravinsky. He'd had several bottles of Chivas Regal by now, I think, so she felt strong. So she said, Maestro, I know that you think that music can't express anything, but I'm very curious as to why, when my husband plays the 2nd one, you cry. I know he plays it wonderfully, and I know it's a wonderful piece of music, but can you explain to me why you cry? And Stravinsky said, it was remember the 2 households? He said, it was the only way I could say sorry to my wife. So this wonderful piece of music is Stravinsky just saying sorry to his wife. So if ever you hear any composer say the notes don't express anything, they're just talking rubbish. I mean, even Stravinsky talking complete nonsense. Stravinsky frequently talked complete nonsense. Great composer, but talked nonsense. So music has an enormous power and eloquence to express what's deep inside a human being to another human being, and therefore to every human being. Think of Shostakovich, for example. I mean, we were talking about this earlier. If you want to know, you want to know, let alone us in the West want to know, what life in the 30s and 40s and early 50s in the Soviet Union was like, you listen to the music of Shostakovich. Tells you absolutely clearly what was happening. Absolutely clearly. There are no books. Maybe Dr. Zhivago, with very few poems, because history was completely rewritten, but the music is there, and the music is an eloquent description of what life was like in the Soviet Union under the Great Terror. Music expresses very clearly human emotions about a time, a place, and what the particular composer wants. And that's what interests me about trying to make films about these things.
Thank you, Tony. Я хотів би додати до коментаря Тоні. Я недавно переглядав на Ютубі струнні квартети Шостаковича, і під одним із них підпис, коментар, який зібрав кілька сотень лайків, і там написано: це ніщо інше, як обурений росіянин говорить про кричить про свою країну, про свої реалії. Я, звичайно, не знав вашої цитати, але в цьому полягає велика правда. І я хотів би повернутися до телебачення. У нас В Україні дуже багато телешоу, які приходять із британського телебачення, X-фактори різні, і танці, музика, розважальні ток-шоу і так далі, реаліті-шоу. Я хотів вас запитатися, що зараз відбувається з британським телебаченням? Чи воно настільки комерціалізоване, що не можна знайти чогось цікавого, чи можна на телебаченні сьогодні в Британії побачити якийсь цікавий продукт, цікаве розслідування журналістів, новий абсолютно проект, не якусь копію для розваги. Ну, в стилі Дональда Макентайра, який робив розслідування про Челсі і так далі. Чи щось відбувається цікаве? Бо в Україні, виявляється, інтелігенція відпливає від телебачення і захоплюється інтернетом, там сидить, в основному у Фейсбуці. Що відбувається в Британії?